That April morning in Darden, Tennessee, felt like any other. The air was damp with fog, the fields still wet with dew. Inside the Bobo home, 20-year-old Holly sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and looking over her nursing notes. She was on her way to class, chasing her dream of becoming a nurse. Her mom was already at work. Her dad was on shift. Only her brother Clint was still home, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Through the window, he caught a glimpse that would haunt him forever: Holly, stepping outside, approached by a man in camouflage. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The two walked side by side, almost casually. But then Clint noticed the grip, the stranger guiding her by the arm, leading her not toward a car, but toward the treeline. The forest. Something deep in his gut twisted. Holly wasn't screaming. She wasn't fighting. But the way she moved wasn't right, stiff, hesitant, like she knew one wrong word could be fatal. Clint froze at the window. Seconds stretched like hours. By the time instinct kicked in, Holly and the man had already melted into the woods. Clint's shaking hand grabbed the phone. 911, my sister, someone took her. The yard was suddenly silent. Only footprints in the grass remained, fading into the woods that had swallowed her whole. The first patrol cars tore down the dirt road, red and blue lights flashing against the trees. What had been an ordinary family yard just hours earlier now looked like the center of a crime scene. Deputies spilled out, rolling yellow tape across the driveway, marking off every inch of ground that might hold a clue. Clint stood on the porch, pale and shaking, replaying the image in his mind. Camouflage, leading her into the woods. She didn't scream. His voice cracked as he spoke, but detectives wrote every word down. In those shaky sentences, they knew, might lie the only description of the man who had just vanished into the timber with Holly. The yard turned into a grid. One investigator crouched low, studying footprints pressed into the damp earth. Another followed a broken twig at the edge of the tree line. K9 units sniffed through the underbrush, handlers tugging hard on their leashes. Volunteers from the town arrived in bright safety vests, forming a line and sweeping through the woods step by step, eyes locked on the ground. Inside a makeshift command post, detectives spread maps across the hood of a cruiser. Circles were drawn in marker: the last sighting, the creek bed, the dirt road that cut north. Radios crackled as search teams checked in. Sector 1, clear. Negative in the riverbed. Each report added weight to the fear building in everyone's chest. Time was slipping away. In abduction cases, every hour widened the distance between victim and home. Detectives knew it. The family knew it. And as the sun sank and the searchline disappeared deeper into the woods, one chilling thought echoed over and over. Was Holly still out there waiting for help, or had the woods already closed in around her? By the second day, Darden was no longer just a quiet town. It was the epicenter of a mystery. News vans lined the narrow streets. Reporters set up tripods in neighbors' yards. Microphones waited for a statement that might explain what had happened to Holly Bobo. But there was no explanation. Only theories. Some whispered, maybe she just walked off, maybe she needed a break from school. Others shook their heads, certain, no, she was taken. Someone planned this. And then came the rumors of a truck, spotted by a neighbor, sitting too long near the road. Every rumor was repeated, twisted, magnified until it felt like fact. For Holly's family, those whispers were knives. Her mother faced the cameras and pleaded, voice breaking, "Whoever has her, please, just let her go." The image aired across Tennessee that night, a mother begging for her daughter's life. Inside the command post, detectives were making their own decision. On a corkboard, Holly's photo was pinned beside a map of the county. 3 words were scrawled in thick black marker: suspected abduction case. That single phrase changed everything. Now the FBI was called in. Federal resources were mobilized. Every gas station, every back road, every scrap of surveillance footage within miles was pulled for review. Volunteers still walked the woods, but the case had outgrown the woods. It was statewide. The phones never stopped ringing. Tips poured in. I saw her at a supermarket in Jackson. She was on the highway headed west. I heard a scream in the woods. Each one demanded officers' time. Each one drained precious hours from the search. And while the public clung to theories, investigators clung to a single truth: if Holly had been abducted, every passing hour made it less likely she would be found alive. Night fell over Darden, but the search didn't stop. The town that once fell silent after sundown now glowed under floodlights. The woods echoed with the shouts of volunteers, the bark of dogs, the hum of helicopters circling overhead. It looked less like a search party and more like a military operation. At the command post, a long folding table was covered with maps of the county. Pushpins dotted the paper in red, blue, and green. Blue for sightings, red for suspicious vehicles, green for areas already cleared. A detective traced circles with a marker, connecting roads to creeks, creeks to backwoods trails. The lines looked like a spider's web. Somewhere in that web, they believed, Holly had vanished. Analysts huddled over grainy surveillance footage. Gas station cameras, traffic lights, convenience stores, they watched them all, frame by frame, searching for a truck, a man in camouflage, anything that didn't belong. At the same time, lab techs examined soil samples, fibers, even broken twigs collected from the Bobos yard. Every negative test still meant progress. Each one ruled out a path, tightening the noose. But in a small town, suspicion spreads quickly. Camouflage wasn't just clothing here, it was a way of life. Hunters, farmers, neighbors, friends. Suddenly, anyone could be the man Clint saw leading his sister into the woods. Every knock on a door felt heavier. Every conversation left detectives wondering if the person in front of them was hiding something. Days stretched into weeks. Helicopters scanned fields. Divers searched rivers. Volunteers tramped through the same woods again and again, boots sinking into the same muddy ground. And yet, there was nothing. For Holly's family, the silence was unbearable. For detectives, it was a cruel reminder: sometimes even an army of searchers can't bring back one missing girl. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And months into years. 3 long years without answers. Inside the Bobo home, time seemed frozen. Holly's picture still sat on the mantel, a flower placed beside the frame. Her chair at the kitchen table stayed empty, but no one had the heart to move it. Every morning began the same way it had the day she vanished, with silence. Detectives never closed the case. They searched the woods again and again, through every season. In the fall, lines of volunteers combed the ridges, orange vests glowing against the trees. In winter, dogs sniffed through frozen ground. In spring, divers dropped into muddy waters, searching riverbeds for bones. Each sweep ended the same: negative. No sign of Holly. On anniversaries, the media returned. Her smile flashed across TV screens, her mother pleading once more, "Please, if anyone knows anything, tell us." Rewards grew: 10,000, 20, 50. Still, no breakthrough came. The leads were endless but hollow. A supposed sighting at a truck stop. A scream in the woods that led nowhere. Someone claiming she'd been seen in another state. Each tip raised hope, then crushed it. For detectives, the case became a labyrinth of dead ends. And for the family, life was a test of endurance. They went to bed each night praying for a call. They woke up each morning to the same silence. Holidays passed without Holly. Birthdays passed with an empty chair. For 3 years, hope was all they had left. Hope that she might still be alive. Hope that someone, somewhere, would finally speak. And then, in September 2014, the woods finally spoke. September 2014. The woods outside Parsons were quiet, the air heavy with late summer heat. 2 men walked slowly, their eyes on the ground, searching not for people but for ginseng roots, a plant worth good money to anyone willing to dig deep in the soil. Then one of them stopped. At first he thought it was just debris, maybe a bucket or an old jug half buried in leaves. But when he brushed the dirt away, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't plastic. It wasn't metal. It was bone. A human skull, staring up from beneath the forest floor. Panic set in. The 2 men stumbled back, fumbling with a phone, dialing the sheriff's office. Within minutes, sirens broke the stillness. Deputies and detectives swarmed the site, stringing yellow tape between the trees. What had been a hunting ground for roots became a crime scene. Forensic teams moved carefully, gloved hands cataloging every fragment. Bits of fabric, scattered bones, soil samples bagged and numbered. It was clear the woods had been holding onto a secret for years, slowly burying it under leaves and rain. The news traveled faster than wildfire. Human remains found in Decatur County. The headline splashed across Tennessee by nightfall. Families gathered around their TVs, whispering the name they all feared to hear. At the Bobo home, detectives knocked on the door. Their faces told the truth before their words did. "We believe we've found Holly." That day, Tennessee stopped speaking in terms of hope. The search had ended. The woods had given her back, but only in pieces, and only in death. The remains were sent to Nashville, where forensic scientists worked in sterile rooms lit by bright, unforgiving lights. Every bone was examined, every fragment catalogued. DNA samples were compared against Holly's parents. The results came back quickly. There was no doubt. The remains were Holly Bobo's. The official report was clinical, stripped of emotion, but the words cut deeper than any headline. A gunshot wound to the back of the head. Close range. Execution style. Detectives carried the report into the sheriff's office, where the family waited. Her mother sat rigid, her hands clenched together. Her father leaned forward, eyes locked on the floor. When the words were spoken, cause of death, gunshot wound, the room broke. Her mother wept openly, her father whispered a prayer, and Clint sat stone still, his face pale, replaying that morning at the window. For investigators, the discovery shifted everything. Holly's case was no longer a missing persons file. It was now a homicide, brutal, deliberate, undeniable. And that meant the pressure to find the killer doubled overnight. At a press conference, the sheriff stood before the cameras, his jaw set. The identity of the remains has been confirmed. We are now pursuing this as a homicide investigation. We will bring justice for Holly. The photograph behind him showed Holly in her nursing scrubs, smiling, a future that would never come. The image played across every screen in Tennessee, no longer as a missing poster, but as the face of a murder victim. The hope that had carried the family for 3 years was gone. In its place was a new demand, justice. And nothing less would be enough. March 2014. Nearly 3 years after Holly disappeared, Decatur County woke to the sound of sirens and breaking news. At a rundown house tucked back from the road, a SWAT team moved in before dawn. The front door shattered under the force of a battering ram. Officers stormed inside, shouting commands on the ground. Now! In the living room, disoriented and barefoot, stood 30-year-old Zachary Ray Adams. Known to police, familiar with trouble, but now accused of something far darker. Within seconds, he was face down on the floor, wrists bound in cuffs. When he was marched outside, cameras were already waiting. His blank, pale face appeared on every screen in Tennessee. The charges were staggering: kidnapping, aggravated rape, first-degree murder. Days later, another raid. This time the target was Jason Autry, Adams's longtime associate. Officers dragged him out in handcuffs. Autry didn't fight. He smirked as cameras clicked. A man who seemed to know his words might soon buy him leverage. Then came John Dylan Adams, Zachary's brother. Arrested quietly, his head down, hands shaking. He wasn't accused of pulling the trigger, but of helping cover it up, of keeping silent when every hour counted. For the first time, there were names. Faces. Men who would have to stand before a judge and answer for Holly Bobo. At a press conference, the district attorney declared, "This investigation has been long and difficult, but today we are moving forward. We will seek justice for Holly." For Holly's family, the arrests were a bitter mix of relief and agony. Relief that someone was finally in custody. Agony that the faces belonged to men from their own county, men who had walked the same roads, shopped in the same stores. Justice had a starting point. But everyone knew the real battle was only just beginning. Inside an interrogation room, lit by a single harsh fluorescent bulb, Jason Autry shifted in his chair. Sweat rolled down his face, his leg bouncing under the table. He knew the charges against him could put him away for life. The only way out was to talk. And so, he began. Autry told investigators that on the morning Holly vanished, he met with Zachary Adams. According to him, Holly was alive then, weak, terrified, but still breathing. Adams had her at his house. Autry claimed they spoke in whispers about what to do next, how to make the problem disappear. His story grew darker. He said they loaded Holly into a blanket and carried her toward a river, planning to sink her in the murky water. But she was still alive. She was moving. "I could hear her breathing," Autry admitted. Then came the moment that froze the detectives. Autry claimed that instead of following through with the plan, Adams changed course. He described how Zachary pulled out a gun, pressed it close, and fired into the back of Holly's head. Execution. Final. Cold. Autry said he helped move the body afterward. He painted himself not as a killer, but as a witness dragged along by fear. To the detectives, it was a chilling account, a timeline that finally explained Holly's disappearance, her death, and why her remains lay scattered in the woods. But every word Autry spoke was weighed carefully. He was a criminal, a man with his own charges hanging over his head. Was he confessing the truth, or simply bargaining for a lighter sentence? Still, his testimony was enough to shift the case. The story was gruesome. The details lined up with the forensics. And for the first time, prosecutors had something powerful to take into court. By 2017, the case of Holly Bobo was ready to move from police files to the courtroom. But as prosecutors gathered in their offices, spreading maps, timelines, and witness statements across long wooden tables, one truth loomed over everything: there was no DNA. No fingerprints. No murder weapon. What they did have were words. Statements. Jason Autry's chilling story. Contradictory remarks from Dylan Adams. Circumstantial evidence that, piece by piece, formed a picture, but one that could still be torn apart. The district attorney knew the defense would attack hard. Where's the gun? Where's the blood? Where's the scientific proof that ties Zachary Adams to Holly's death? Those questions would echo in the jury's minds, and the state had to find a way to answer without the evidence everyone expected. Instead, they leaned into psychology. They would put Autry on the stand, force the jury to look him in the eyes as he relived that morning by the river. They would remind the jury that criminals don't always leave behind neat trails of evidence. And they would show Holly's family, their pain, their loss, as the human face of the case. Meanwhile, Adams's defense attorneys sharpened their blades. Their strategy was brutally simple: dismantle every witness. Paint Autry as a liar, Dillon as confused, and the state's case as nothing more than a story built on desperation. In the courthouse, seats were being filled. Jurors were selected, sworn in, and prepared to hear a case that would determine whether a young woman's life was brutally taken by the man sitting just feet away from them. The prosecution had passion. The defense had doubt. And in a trial, doubt can be just as powerful as evidence. September 2017. 6 years after Holly vanished, the courtroom in Savannah, Tennessee, was packed to capacity. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the shuffle of reporters' pens and the low hum of whispers from the gallery. On one side of the room sat Holly's family. Her mother's hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her father leaned forward, eyes fixed on the floor. Clint, the brother who had watched Holly disappear into the woods, sat rigid, his jaw tight. On the other side sat Zachary Adams. Pale, expressionless, but restless in the small shifts of his hands. For 6 years, his name had been whispered in suspicion. Now, for the first time, it would be shouted in court. The judge's gavel struck wood. The trial began. The prosecutor rose first. His voice was measured, but each word landed with force. This is the story of a young woman whose future was stolen. Holly Bobo wanted nothing more than to become a nurse, to help others. But on April 13, 2011, she was taken from her own yard. Held against her will. And murdered by the man sitting right here. He pointed to Adams. You will hear the testimony. You will see the evidence. And by the end, there will be no doubt who is responsible. The room felt colder with every sentence. Jurors leaned forward. Holly's mother wiped tears from her face. When it was the defense's turn, the tone shifted. Calm, almost teacher-like. Ladies and gentlemen, this is indeed a tragedy. But tragedy is not proof. Where is the DNA? Where is the weapon? Where is one piece of evidence that cannot be explained away? The state wants you to believe the words of criminals, men who would say anything to save themselves. Ask yourselves, is that justice? Adams stared at the floor. Portrayed as a monster by one side, as a victim of lies by the other, his fate now rested in 12 strangers' hands. The trial had begun. And Tennessee was watching. The second week of trial brought 2 men who never imagined they'd stand in a courtroom. They weren't detectives or experts. They were ginseng hunters, ordinary locals who had wandered into the woods one September day in 2014 and stumbled on a nightmare. They took their seats nervously, rough hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. The prosecutor spoke gently. Can you tell the jury what you saw that day? The older of the 2 cleared his throat. His voice shook. We were walking slow, looking for roots. Then I saw something white in the leaves. At first, I thought it was a bucket. But when I brushed it off, he stopped, fighting to continue. It was a skull. Human. No mistake about it. The courtroom fell silent. Even the scratch of pens stopped. Jurors stared, wide-eyed, as the image settled in their minds. The men described how they froze, then called police, how the woods filled with sirens and deputies marking the ground with yellow tape. They spoke of seeing fragments, scraps of fabric, the unmistakable presence of death hiding just beneath the forest floor. No one interrupted. The defense could not shake the raw honesty of their words. There was no motive, no deal to be made. Just two men, haunted by what they found. Holly's family sat trembling. For them, it was reliving the moment their last fragile hope had died. For the jury, it was a visceral reminder that this was not just a story. Holly was real. Her body was real. And her death was undeniable. When the hunters finally stepped down, the room felt heavier. The woods of Decatur County had walked right into that courtroom, and no one would ever forget what they brought with them. The courtroom was tense when Jason Autry took the stand. He was the prosecution's star witness, the man whose words tied Zachary Adams directly to Holly's murder. But everyone knew this would be the hardest day of the trial. The defense attorney rose slowly, papers in hand, his tone deceptively calm. "Mr. Autry, you're currently serving time in prison, correct?" "Yes." "And you've been convicted of drug dealing, weapons charges, theft, the list goes on?" Autry shifted. "Yes." "And today, you're hoping your testimony might help reduce your own sentence, isn't that right?" The words hung in the air. Autry hesitated, then muttered, "Yes." Jurors glanced at each other. The seed of doubt was planted. The defense pressed harder. "You told investigators one version of events in 2014. A different version in 2015. And now, yet another version here in this courtroom. So tell us, Mr. Autry, which one is the truth?" The attorney's voice sliced through the silence. Autry's answers faltered. He looked less like a witness and more like a man cornered. The defense hammered the point: no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon. Just the word of a career criminal trying to save himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer said, turning to the jury, "are you willing to convict a man on nothing more than this?" On the other side of the room, Zachary Adams sat motionless, but for the first time, a hint of a smile flickered across his face. His lawyers had done what they set out to do: shake the jury's confidence. The prosecution still had emotional weight. But the defense had planted something just as powerful: reasonable doubt. September 2017. The jury filed back into the courtroom, 12 faces unreadable. The gallery rose as the judge entered. Holly's family sat trembling, hands locked together, as if bracing for a storm. On the defense side, Zachary Adams sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes darting from the jurors to the floor. He had been painted as a monster, a liar, a killer. Now 12 strangers would decide if he would ever walk free again. The judge cleared his throat. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman stood, a folded slip of paper trembling in her hand. Her voice cracked slightly, but the words were clear: on the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. The room froze, then erupted. Gasps. Cries. A stifled sob from Holly's mother. Her father bowed his head, whispering something too quiet to hear. Clint sat forward, stunned, as if the words had struck him physically. The foreperson continued. On the charge of aggravated kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of aggravated rape, guilty. Each word landed like a hammer. Guilty. 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 For the family, it was vindication wrapped in heartbreak. They had justice, but not their daughter. For the prosecution, it was the culmination of 6 long years. For the defense, it was a crushing defeat. The jury had believed the story despite the missing pieces. Adams sat expressionless, but a muscle in his jaw twitched as deputies tightened the cuffs around his wrists. The verdict was in. The state of Tennessee had spoken. When the judge dismissed the jury, the sound of relief swept through the gallery. Some wept. Others whispered, "Finally." After 6 years of silence, searching, and sorrow, Holly Bobo's name had been answered with one word that carried the weight of justice: guilty. The day after the verdict, the courtroom filled once again. This time, no one expected surprises. The question wasn't guilt anymore, it was punishment. Zachary Adams shuffled into the room, shackles clinking with each step. His face was pale, but his chin was lifted, almost defiant. He sat down heavily, staring at the table in front of him, refusing to meet the eyes of the family across the aisle. The judge spoke slowly, his tone steady, each word deliberate. "Zachary Ry Adams, you have been found guilty of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Holly Lynn Bobo. Your crimes are monstrous, calculated, and beyond forgiveness. It is the order of this court that you serve life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. The words echoed through the chamber. Holly's mother broke into sobs, her hands covering her face. Her father bowed his head, whispering a prayer of thanks and grief all at once. Clint clenched his fists, his body shaking, the memory of that morning at the window pressing down on him like a weight he could never escape. Adams did not flinch. He barely moved, his expression blank, as if the sentence had already been carved into him long before the words were spoken. For a fleeting moment, he raised his head and looked toward the Bobos, a cold, hollow stare that lasted a heartbeat before deputies pulled him to his feet. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. When the sentence was announced, applause broke out. "Justice for Holly," voices shouted, echoing through the streets of Savannah. For the community, it was closure. For the family, it was a small piece of peace carved from unimaginable pain. Life without parole. 50 extra years. Zachary Adams would never walk free again. While Zachary Adams was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars, the story wasn't finished. 2 other names still lingered in the case: Dylan Adams and Jason Autry. Dylan, Zachary's younger brother, was never accused of pulling the trigger. But investigators said he knew, that he had seen and heard more than he admitted. His statements shifted over time, sometimes confessing, sometimes denying, leaving prosecutors and defense attorneys to argue over whether he was a liar or simply confused. In the end, Dylan took a plea deal. He admitted to facilitating the crime and helping to cover it up. For that, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Some called it too light. Others believed it was the only way to secure accountability without dragging the family through another drawn-out trial. Then there was Jason Autry, the man who had described Holly's final hours in such grim detail. The man whose testimony had been the backbone of the prosecution's case. Autry had been staring at a possible death sentence himself, but his cooperation changed everything. He struck a deal: testify against Zachary Adams in exchange for leniency. For the prosecution, it was a necessary compromise. For the community, it was bitter medicine. A man who admitted to helping move Holly's body, who claimed to have stood by as her life was ended, would not spend the rest of his own behind bars. Is that justice? People in Parsons whispered. That he gets to walk sooner, just because he talked? The legal system doesn't always trade in absolutes. It trades in leverage. And Jason Autry had exactly what prosecutors needed: words that painted the picture of what happened to Holly. For the Bobo family, each plea, each deal, reopened wounds. But slowly, one by one, the men connected to Holly's murder were held accountable. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough for the law to call it justice. Many believed the trial's end would finally close the book on Holly Bobo. But in the world of law, nothing is ever truly finished. Zachary Adams's defense team immediately filed appeals. They argued the trial had been unfair, poisoned by media attention, dependent on unreliable witnesses. They pointed to the absence of DNA, the missing murder weapon, the contradictions in Jason Autry's testimony. Each filing kept the case alive, forcing judges to revisit the same painful questions. For Holly's family, each appeal was another wound. Every time a hearing was scheduled, they had to sit through the story again: the morning Holly vanished, the discovery in the woods, the gunshot that ended her life. It was like being trapped in a loop, reliving the nightmare over and over. The media didn't let go either. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and nightly news specials returned to the story year after year. Holly's smile appeared on screens across America, not as a missing poster anymore, but as the face of a case that divided opinion. Some viewers questioned whether justice had truly been served. Others insisted the verdict was the only possible outcome. By 2022, the Tennessee Supreme Court weighed in. After reviewing the record, the justices upheld the conviction. The guilty verdict stood. Adams's sentence of life without parole remained. It should have been the end. But public doubt lingers when a case rests so heavily on the word of criminals. Every new podcast, every late-night segment, stirred up the same old questions. Was the truth fully told? Was the right man behind bars? For the Bobos, the courts had spoken. But in their hearts, peace remained elusive. Justice had been declared, yet the shadow of the case refused to fade. In 2024, a shockwave rippled through Tennessee's legal system. Jason Autry, the man whose testimony had carried the prosecution's case, announced he was taking it back. From a prison cell, Autry signed a statement claiming his story had been false. "I never saw Zachary Adams pull the trigger," he wrote. "I told investigators what they wanted to hear. It was the bombshell the defense had been waiting for." For years they had argued that Adams had been convicted on the word of a career criminal trying to save his own skin. Now, with Autry himself admitting he lied, the entire case seemed to tremble. When the news broke, headlines exploded. Star witness recants testimony. Talk shows and podcasts dissected every angle. Why would Autry admit to lying now, when his own deal was already sealed? Was it guilt? Revenge? Or another play for attention? In court, Adams's attorneys seized the opportunity. They filed for a new trial, insisting the conviction could not stand without Autry's testimony. The prosecution countered, pointing to other evidence: Dylan Adams's shifting statements, the timeline, the remains in the woods, the circumstantial threads that still tied Zachary to Holly's death. Judges listened carefully, weighing the arguments. But in the end, the ruling was firm: the conviction stands. Autry's recantation, they said, was not enough to overturn years of legal proceedings. For Holly's family, it was agony to relive the trial yet again, to hear Autry's name dragged back into the headlines. But they clung to the court's decision. The man convicted of murdering Holly would not walk free. Still, doubt had been planted once more. Once a witness admits, "I lied," the truth can never feel entirely solid again. And in the court of public opinion, the shadows returned. Even after his role in the Holly Bobo case was over, Jason Autry couldn't escape trouble. In 2024, his name appeared in headlines once again, but this time it wasn't about testimony. It was about federal charges. Autry, already a convicted felon, had been caught with firearms. Under federal law, that alone was enough to guarantee years behind bars. Prosecutors laid out the case in stark, simple terms: no plea deals, no dramatic testimony, just cold evidence that a man with a violent past had broken the law yet again. In a Memphis federal courtroom, Autry listened as the charges were read. Gone was the swagger he once showed on the stand. There were no bargaining chips left to play. He pled guilty, and when the judge delivered the sentence, it was crushing: 20 years in federal prison. The ruling meant Autry would spend the prime of his remaining life behind razor wire, far removed from Decatur County. For many in Tennessee, it felt like belated justice. One local man told reporters, "Maybe the court sentenced him for guns, but everyone here knows it's really for what he did in 2011. For Holly's family, the news was complicated. They had already endured the pain of hearing Autry recant, of watching him twist the story for years. Now, at least, they knew he wouldn't walk free anytime soon. Autry's downfall was a reminder that lies and deals might work for a while, but eventually, the truth or the law catches up. He may have helped secure Zachary Adams's conviction, but in the end, his own choices sealed his fate. As the federal doors slammed shut, Jason Autry disappeared from Tennessee's daily news. For the first time in years, the Bobos could try to breathe without his shadow looming over them. Years after the verdict, the appeals, and the headlines, the story of Holly Bobo still echoes through Tennessee. The trials ended, the sentences handed down, but for her family, the silence in their home never lifted. Holly's picture still hangs in the living room, her smile frozen in time. Each spring, the community gathers at the church, not to mourn, but to remember. Friends, classmates, neighbors, all speaking her name, making sure she is more than just the girl from the news. Her dream of becoming a nurse lives on in scholarships and memorials. Families touched by her story have started foundations, raising awareness for missing persons. Out of tragedy, a quiet kind of hope has taken root. For investigators, the case remains a lesson written in hard ink. Sometimes there is no perfect evidence. No clear fingerprint, no neat confession. Sometimes, all you have are fragments, contradictions, and the will to keep pushing until justice is found. For the Bobos, justice will never feel like enough. They live with the truth that Holly will never walk through their front door again. But they also carry the truth that her story changed people, that her name became a call for vigilance, compassion, and strength. The woods that once swallowed her have long since grown quiet. The headlines have faded. But in Tennessee, Holly Bobo is not forgotten. Her story is told not just as a crime, but as a reminder: justice may not heal, but it promises that the lost will not vanish into silence. And as long as her name is spoken, Holly lives on.